from 1700 to 1800, which you could say is the transitional century. During this century, the 18th century, the Muslim world, by and large, was in a lot of decline. The main Muslim empires of the day were the three, what they call the three gunpowder empires, the Ottoman, Mughal and Safavid, which I'm sure you've heard of. They were then in their period of decline after about 1700. 1707 is the year when Aurangzeb died, who was like the pinnacle of the Mughal emperors. And after his time, generally there was a slow decline. Similarly with the Ottoman and Safavid empires, we saw similar kind of thing. And during this century, we saw Europe, the European nations such as Britain, France, being the main ones, and also before them Spain and Portugal, creating their world empires, starting to create their world empires for the first time, and gradually eclipsing the Muslims' power in the world. So, and then from 1800 onwards, really, we see, very much a dominance of the European empires, followed quickly by the rise of America as well in the 20th century. So it's important to remember that from around about 650, which is the time when Islam first erupted and took over many parts of the world, from about 650 all the way up to 1700, over 1,000 years, on this earth, the Muslims were the dominant power. They were the dominant civilization. In the early centuries, they were united under one Khalifa, and in later centuries, they were divided into many different sultanates and kingdoms, but still, overall representing the Islamic civilization. And the thing that they all had in common, all of these Muslim empires and kingdoms, was that they were based on the rule of the Quran. So it was a Quranic civilization, And this was the state of world affairs for over 1,000 years. We want to remember that. Sometimes as Muslims we start becoming, like depressed and all that, and thinking, God, what's happened to us? What's happened to the Muslims? Why are we so sort of, downtrodden all around the world? So this is relatively recent now, from about 1700 onwards, where Europe for the first time begins to start dominating the world scene. Now, after about the first so I said about 1,000 years Islam was a dominant civilization. At the end of the first 500 years, we saw what we call Orthodox Sunni, the Orthodox Sunni pattern emerging. Well, not emerging, it had fully emerged by 500 years after Hijrah. So what do we mean by the Orthodox Sunni majority? I don't want to call it a sect, because the whole point of Sunnism is not a sect. It doesn't believe in breaking into sects. That's why I don't like to actually say Sunni sect. So we just say the Sunni majority. Because that's actually the defining point about Sunnism, is that we stick with the Jama'ah. We don't actually break up into small groups and splinter off. We stick with the majority body of Muslims. And this was the teaching of the Prophet ﷺ, which was very strongly instilled into the Sahaba. So we saw that in the Sahaba, under any cost, they would not divide the Muslims. They would not divide the Muslim Ummah. Now, so by about 500, what it meant to be the majority group, the Sunni group, and they were known as Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah from very early on, because once again they define themselves as those that don't split up. We're not the Khawarij, we're not the Shia, we're the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. We follow the Sunnah and the Jama'ah, the majority following of the companions, the Sahaba. That was the key thing, that we follow the example of the Sahaba. By about 500, it had become very clear what it means to be a Sunni Muslim or Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, and this was composed of three strands. And the reason why I have to obviously explain this is because we can't understand modern movements and sects that have arisen if we don't know what was Orthodox Sunni Islam in the first place. And part of the confusion that's been created in modern times is some of those groups that have arisen have actually claimed to be Ahl Sunnah, when they're clearly not, because this is the Sunni majority of the Ahl Sunnah is a historical reality. No one can change history. This is what I'm trying to get across. So by 500 after Hijri, it was very clear that the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah were those people that were following four basic schools of law. The Hanafi school, the Maliki school, the Shafi'i school, and the Hanbali school. Yeah? Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, actually came about at that juncture. He died in 505 Hijri. And he was actually one of the main figures that very much helped to elucidate what was the meaning of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. So by that time the scholars had agreed, there's four schools of law. No new school can really come about now, because many centuries have passed since the early days of the Sahaba and the companions and their students. Many centuries have passed since the time of the first four Imams, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi'i. It's been 500 years. The fiqh of those four schools has been written down, commentaries have been done on it, a lot of work has been put into that. And it was a general agreement amongst the ulama that these are the four schools of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, of fiqh, of Islamic law. And these schools, they also had associated schools of Aqidah. So for example, the Hanafi school tended to follow the Maturidi school of Aqidah. The Shafi'i school tended to be associated with the Ash'ari school of Aqidah. All of these were within Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And pretty much there's hardly any difference between those schools. The four schools, and also with the schools of Aqidah, Maturidi and Ash'ari, are pretty much exactly the same. There's not much difference. Few points of difference of minor issues. From 500 Hijri to 1000 years, so this is now coming up to about 650, because this is Christian era or common era. I won't use the Hijri dates here because we're not very familiar with them. But so for the following 500 years, that's what Ahl Sunnah was. So from 500 Hijri to 1000 Hijri, or we could say from the 11th to the 17th century Common Era, for a good 5 centuries, that was Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. The people who followed the four madhabs, the people who followed those schools of Aqidah, the Maturidi and Ash'ari, and very importantly, there was also a general acceptance amongst the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah of the people of Tasawwuf, or the Sufis as they were called. So the Sufis, the Sufi teachings, the Tasawwuf, the purification of the heart, that was accepted across the board by Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, by the Sunni ulama. I guarantee you, it's a historical fact. No one can dispute that. Now, of course, there were those ulama that came about that criticized some of the innovations that were taking place. And that happened in all times, So there were great figures within Sufism itself and from the ulama as well, that often said, the Sufis are doing certain things which are going to excess or going beyond what is the norm of the religion, But no one rejected the practice of Tasawwuf or the way of the Sufi shuyukh, as long as, obviously, they stay within the teachings of the Sharia. So this is what I mean here by Sunni orthodoxy, the orthodox belief, the standard Sunni belief. Now when we come to the modern age, where Europe now, from the 1700 to 1800, we see European countries increasingly gaining dominance over Muslim lands, They first started by colonizing peripheral areas, like the Americas and other aboriginal places which couldn't really defend themselves. And they made themselves very rich from those colonial conquests. And with those newfound riches and with the newfound philosophy and science of Europe, they were then able, with their newfound strength, to start taking over some Muslim lands. So by 1800, you see the Mughal Empire is coming to an end. The British are taking over India. The Ottoman Empire is very weak compared to how it used to be. Napoleon has landed in Egypt, So Europeans coming to the heartland of Muslims. Now this led to these type of reactions from the Muslims. This is what we're going to focus on today, inshallah. This led to a great crisis amongst the Muslims and a great reflection. What's going on? Why is Islam being defeated? Muslims had never known defeat. So we then see in the Muslim world scholars, different movements arising which are trying to understand what's gone wrong. Why have Muslims declined, and what do we need to do to put this right? Come in, inshallah. You can see the water. You can't see too well from there, but just maybe move around if one. Now, several different types of responses emerge to this new European invasion, really, of Muslim lands and European dominance. And these responses are really the Muslims trying to understand what's happened, why are Muslims declining, what have we done wrong, we must have left our deen, And you can generally classify them into three or four different types of new trends that arose. The first one was the Wahhabi reaction, and inshallah we'll go into the history of this movement in a little bit of detail. Also known popularly as Salafism or Salafis. Now obviously Wahhabis don't call themselves Wahhabis. This was a term that was given to them by other Muslims and by historians as well. The original Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab called his movement the Muwahhidun. They called themselves the Muwahhidun, the people of Tawheed. And then they splintered into many different groups, which we'll probably talk about if we have time. Now this group or this movement was a repeat of an ancient group which was called the Khawarij. So this is what we call them Neo-Kharijites. In English they call them Kharijites. It was the same group that had arisen before in the Ummah on many occasions, not just once, but through many centuries of history of Islam. So it was the same group, the same teachings, the same type of movement. Then we had a group of Westernized secular Muslims. These were Muslims that felt that, for Muslims to come back up, we had to imitate and copy and learn from the West. But they took it to such an extent that they almost left Islam, you could say, and inshallah we'll talk about them a bit more as well. Then we had, and from amongst them, you obviously have different strands, just like in Western political thought, you have different types of ideologies. Because these were people that were imitating Westerners, they also, some of them were liberal, some of them were Marxist, and so on. And then you had the third group, the third large group, who we can call the Rationalist Modernists. And we'll talk about them as well. These were really a type of Muslims who were very impressed with the West. They said we have to learn from the West, but they at the same time clung firm to a strong belief in Islam. That we believe in the Sharia, we believe in Islam, but at the same time they went to a slightly extreme in imitating the philosophy and the rationalism of the West, and in that way they resembled another ancient group that had arisen in the Muslim Ummah, which were called the Mu'tazilites. So it's very interesting that these groups, they were actually mirrors of previous groups, So the Wahhabis were like the Khawarij, and the Rationalists, they were like the Mu'tazilites that had arisen early in Islamic history as well. And then finally you had, those people who were sticking to the traditional Orthodox Sunni Islam. So remember we talked about Sunni Orthodoxy, the following of the four madhabs, with the theology of Ash'ari Maturidi and the Tasawwuf. That's what we now can call the sort of traditionalists. They wanted to stick to that formula, and they wanted to have a revival of Islam based on that same formula, rather than making any drastic changes. Now, the other aspect to remember, which can confuse the picture, is that then there also were political movements. These are all what we have described as revivalist movements, attempts to revive Islam, or the Muslims, let's say. But then you had, after the fall of the Ottoman Caliphate in 1924, the last Muslim empire, the last Muslim Caliphate was destroyed. From that time on, there also arose in the Ummah several political movements whose aim was to re-establish the Caliphate, to re-establish Muslim leadership under one person, the Khalifa. Now, these movements could contain any of the above. They could contain Salafis, they could contain the Rationalists, they could contain Traditionalists. They didn't contain, the only one that they wouldn't contain were the Westernized Secularists, for the simple reason I mentioned, that these are the people that really didn't believe in the Sharia anymore. Right? They were still Muslims by name, but they believe the Sharia is out of date and we have to have Western liberal democracy or Marxism, whatever. So they were not calling for Sharia, but all of the other groups, so the other three groups, the Salafi, Wahhabi groups, and the Rationalist Modernist groups, and the Traditionalists all believed in the Sharia and all wanted the Sharia back. So these political movements could be composed of any or all or a mixture of those groups. If anyone would like to just ask questions, just go ahead, because I've gone into a sort of a lecture mode there, which at the beginning of the thing I was thinking I'm going to make it more for discussion. And so it's a bad habit, I have of just lecturing people, so please feel free to chip in,
About what year was the Wahhabi movement started?
We're going to go into the history of it. That's the only problem if you do ask questions. It's probably going to come up in a minute. So. We're going to go into some detail into the Wahhabi movement, inshallah, and some of these others as well. So.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Generally, a lot of people do not like to call them Wahhabis because it is an attribute of Allah. They call them Najdi, or they don't call them Wahhabi because it is an attribute of Allah. Wahhab is an attribute of Allah. And Abdul Wahhab, the servant of Wahhab.
Yeah.
So they call them Najdi because that's where they actually started.
Yeah, you can call them Najdis. A fair point. I mean, just historically in history books, you will see them referred to as Wahhabi. So it's but fair point. Okay, so that's where we'll start.
When did the Shias come about?
The Shias came about in very early in Islam. So you're talking about in the first generation. So you're talking way back in the 7th century. So the Shia is a very, very early schism in Islam. So it's not considered part of this modernist movement. Right, so among Shias they have the same types of modernist trends as well, as we do in Sunni Islam. Anyway, so we'll start with the Wahhabi movement, because actually it sort of arose earliest historically. The main person, obviously, who founded the movement was Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab that you mentioned. You see his photo there. I'll leave it to yourselves to decide whether there's nur there or lack of nur. I won't make any comments on subjective issues like that. So 1792 he died. He was born in Najd, eastern part of Arabia. As you know, probably that's the place that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam refused to bless. You know. So the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam one day was making dua for Sham. Allahumma barik lana fi Shamina. Oh Allah, give us blessings in our Sham, which is Syria, Palestine. Allahumma barik lana fi Yamanina. Then he said, oh Allah, give us blessings in our Yemen, which is the south of Arabia. And then one of the people present said, oh Ya Rasulullah, what about our Najd, which is the eastern side of Arabia? Makkah and Medina, they're in the Hijaz, which is the western side. So the eastern side of Arabia is known as Najd. So they said, what about our Najd? The Prophet ﷺ remained silent. And he repeated the dua for Allahumma barik lana fi Shamina, Allahumma barik lana fi Yamanina. Once again the man said, what about our Najd? The Prophet ﷺ once again remained silent. The third time the man said, what about Najd? On the third time the Prophet ﷺ looked at him and said, surely the two horns of shaitan will come from that place. So the Prophet ﷺ refused to make dua for the Najd. Very interesting point. You know, Musaylima al-Kadhab, who you may have heard of, Musaylima the liar, who was a false prophet and fought against the Sahaba, he was from the Najd as well. Okay. So Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab is born into a village in the Najd. He grows up in a scholarly family, he becomes a scholar. He then develops these ideas, right? And he starts saying, you know, that Muslims have all gone wrong. There's too much bid'ah and shirk. There's too much innovation and shirk going on in the ummah. We need to clean things up, you know. Now, you know, obviously there was an element of truth to his teaching, because, you know, many Muslims had gone way off tangent by that stage. However, he took this to a militant level, you know, of starting accusing people, Muslims, who are doing these sort of things, of being kafirs. And after accusing them of being kafir, he said it's halal to take the sword against them, and we fight them and we kill them. So this is the classic Khawarij picture. Yeah? They make takfir of Muslims, they accuse other Muslims of being disbelievers, and then they fight them. The Sahaba refused that. The Sahaba adamantly refused that. Any Muslim, you know, if they say the Shahada and they turn towards the Qibla and they eat our halal, you know, as the Prophet ﷺ said, then they're from the Muslims. You know, we don't fight them, we don't kill them. Their blood is sacred. The Khawarij, they went against that. They were the first people to shed the blood of Muslims. And so this trend was exactly a Khawarij type of tendency.
Well, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Was he also, I mean, there's many myths around him, and sometimes one gets confused what is fact and what is fiction. At that sort of time, obviously we see the emergence of the West as we know it, and their colonial desires. Wasn't it about the same time that they befriended him as well? Is there some truth in that the colonials befriended him and used him as a tool?
Yeah. I'm not sure about Muhammad ibn Wahhab himself.
Okay.
Definitely his descendants, when they came into power for the second time,
Yeah.
and established the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, they were sponsored by the British.
Yeah.
But the first time I'm not sure about, and I don't know if there's any evidence for that.
Really? Okay.
But it's possible. I haven't really looked into
Because
that.
obviously at that point the Ottomans were still very much in.
Yeah.
You know, they
So
were in
yeah,
charge.
we'll go into that, inshallah. So Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab, he comes about, he starts preaching this thing. He goes up to the leader of a local Bedouin tribe, whose name was Ibn Saud. And he says to him, look, you know, if you follow my teaching, I will make you the leader. You'll be the political leader, and I'll be the religious leader. You know? So Ibn Saud agreed. He went to others first who refused him. Obviously he rejected the following of madhabs. That was the other key thing which differentiated from Ahl Sunnah. He said, we don't need the schools of law, the Hanafi, etc. We want to go back to the Quran and Sunnah. So a clear breach from the Sunni Orthodox tradition which I was talking about. So he then he makes a pact with Muhammad ibn Saud. And that pact carries on until today. So the head of the Saud family is the king in Saudi Arabia, and the head of the Abdul Wahhab, Ibn Abdul Wahhab's family, until today they are the religious authorities in Saudi Arabia. They're one of the famous families. Yeah.
Was Abdul Wahhab from a madhab himself originally?
He was Hanafi. His father was Hanafi.
Or,
The stories are that his father completely rejected him.
which,
Some people say that his father was very strict Hanafi.
right.
And there's a story, I don't know how much truth there is to this, but they say that his father actually, once he had like a gold tooth or something because he had dental problems. And his father being a strict Hanafi, and he had an opinion that it's not allowed in the madhab, and he was very sort of angry with him and told him off, and they say that's what made him, go against the Hanafi madhab, Allah alim. His brother was also an alim and wrote a refutation against him. His brother actually wrote a book called Sawa'iq al-Ilahiyya ala Radd al-Wahhabiyya, the heavenly thunderbolts in refutation of the Wahhabiyya. That book is published and can be found in Damascus, is where I
So
saw
was
it.
he a Hanafi as well? His brother?
They were Hanafis.
Mashallah.
Yeah.
Amazing.
His name was Suleiman.
So Sulman, his brother.
Yeah.
Now, just a bit of background which I want to skip a little bit. So this is the point where he takes bay'ah with Muhammad ibn Saud. He says, you are the settlement's chief and wise man, I want you to grant me an oath that you will perform jihad against the unbelievers. Now when he says unbelievers, remember he means a lot of Muslims which he's accusing to be unbelievers. In return you will be Imam, leader of the Muslim community, and I will be leader and religious. From there they actually took power in Arabia in the first time, which lasted from 1744 to 1818. They took power, they killed many Muslims, they defeated the Ottoman army, and they took power in Arabia because they had accused the Ottomans of being non-believers. Yeah.
So they were from the eastern part of Arabia.
Yeah.
And then through with their military, did they take control, or did they use like
With the tribal warriors.
with the warriors? So they forcefully took control,
Yeah.
and they're still in control of Arabia until today.
No, we'll go through it, but that was the first time they took control. Then they were defeated by the Ottomans. Then they took again, and this is the second time now. So the first time lasted until 1818. In 1818, one of the Ottoman generals from Egypt, his name was Muhammad Ali, he actually defeated them and took back Arabia under Ottoman Khilafah. Yeah? So this is, these two families are still the ruling families in Arabia till today. So we'll skip a bit of this. So this was the second time now. So in 1818, the Ottoman General Muhammad Ali Pasha defeats them. They went into exile for a while. They were in Kuwait. They survived. Eventually in 1926 now. So this is following the First World War, following the imminent collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Actually the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1924. In 1926, they see the power vacuum and they come back and they seize power in Arabia from the Sharifs, who were actually the custodians of the Haramain. On this occasion, they were called the Ikhwan. Yeah? In the first occasion, they were called Muwahhidun. On this occasion, Abdulaziz ibn Saud, who was the leader of the tribe, he had his, the tribal militant Salafi followers that were called the Ikhwan. They took over the Hijaz, they took over Mecca and Medina, and on this occasion they had support from the British. The British were actually covertly supporting both sides, the Sharifs and the Najdis.
Typical.
But, yeah, exactly, putting their thing everywhere. When they took over Arabia, they established the Saudi kingdom. The Ikhwan fighters actually, with this, they were full of this sort of zeal for jihad. They wanted to carry on the jihad. They wanted to go into Jordan and in every direction, with their, with the teaching of militant jihad. Britain at the time controlled Jordan. So here was a big problem, for the leader Abdulaziz ibn Saud. He had got support from the British. Now he's taken over Arabia, but his fighters, full of this, jihadi zeal, they said we need to carry on the jihad. We're not going to stop here. We're going to take over the world. So at that point, Abdulaziz ibn Saud actually sent his other part of his army and massacred the Ikhwan. So there was a massive slaughter. He slaughtered his own Ikhwan fighters. These are sort of things in history that, we really need to bring out that many people don't realize, So this is how the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is then formally announced in 1932. Now at this point the Saudi king, Abdulaziz, declares himself the custodian of the holy masjids. The Ottoman Khilafah has been disintegrated, so they were now trying to portray themselves as the new caliphs. Although they never claimed the title of Khalifa, to their credit in a way I guess, they never arrogated themselves to that level. They only claimed to be king, but they wanted to project themselves as now the new leaders of the Muslim world because they now control the Haramain, Makkah and Medina. However, they were completely and flatly rejected by the rest of the Sunni world, who accused them of being Wahhabis, and didn't like their practice of knocking down graves of Sahaba and trying to interfere with the grave of the Prophet ﷺ and so on. This caused outrage in the Muslim world, and so they had a real problem here. They wanted the Muslim world to accept them. So, interesting thing happened in 1924 when the Ottoman Khilafah was finally dismantled. Al-Azhar, the ulama of Al-Azhar, they called a conference for the following year, 1925. And the conference's aim was to elect a new Khalifa for the Muslim world. They invited leading ulama from around the Muslim world, from around the different Muslim countries. And their explicit intention at first was we need to choose a Khalifa from amongst ourselves. Now by the time the conference came about, they had slightly changed the agenda because that was felt to be just very, very difficult thing to follow through. So it had become a conference to discuss about the Khilafah rather than actually appointing one, Now the Saudis didn't like this move, So what the Saudis did, they actually set up an alternative conference in Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in the same time as the one that was taking place in Al-Azhar, and they tried to make it a much more grand, putting more money into it and all of that stuff. So they sort of disrupted the one in Al-Azhar. But the one in Al-Azhar did take place, but did not succeed in actually electing a Khalifa, although they did publish some very interesting proceedings of the conference about, the Muslims' need for a Khalifa, etc. Now what happens, the Saudis, they realize they're not really being accepted by the general Sunni world. At the same time, an interesting development has taken place, which is the discovery of oil. Oil was not really a feature of the global economy before the First World War. It's only really during and after, during the First World War, so in the early 1900s, where oil suddenly becomes a major source of fuel and rapidly becomes the leading source of fuel for the global economy. Yeah, before that it was coal, people were even burning wood, things like that. Yeah? So oil becomes a major factor, and then they find out that in Arabia there's huge reserves of oil. Until today, the country with the largest reserves of oil, right? So suddenly now, this new kingdom of Saudi Arabia has also become a very wealthy kingdom. So that has a consequence, two consequences. First of all, the Western powers, especially America now, which is emerging as the main power, become very interested in the oil. So they make an alliance with the Saudi kings. Right? You let the American companies drill the oil, take out the oil, refine the oil. At that time, the Arabs didn't even have the technology to do those things anyway. So they had to get someone in, So the Americans, they're very quick to get in there. So they make a very close alliance. You let our companies take the oil, you get rich, and we get rich. Yeah? You scratch my back, I scratch your back. Type of thing, which lasts until today, which is carrying on full steam ahead until today. You can Google, pictures of the Bush family and the Saudi family. Very, very cozy, relationship between those two people until today. Secondly, the Saudis realize that with the immense amount of money they now have, obviously limited to the royal family, because they're not going to let that money go to the general people of the country that it should go to. So the Americans are propping them up, keeping them in power, as long as this arrangement stays in place. That the wealth from the oil is shared between both parties. And doesn't go to the ordinary, normal Muslims of the Ummah, where it should be going. So the Saudis then realize also with the money they can put that to good use. And they can use that to propagate their doctrines. They can use that money to propagate the teachings of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. So they set about doing that in a very systematic fashion, using the vast money resources they now have at their disposal. So they set up universities, they get scholars teaching those universities to propagate those teachings of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. They flood the Muslim world with free literature. So the teachings of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, let's call them Wahhabi teachings for the sake of simplicity, or let's say Salafi teachings. They flood the Muslim world with free literature. They open up masjids and schools and universities in other Muslim countries as well, with funding from the Saudis. And obviously the implicit agenda there is, if you're going to take that funding and you open up that institution, you have to then also teach what is acceptable to us. They sponsor students from every country of the Muslim world. Every year, a cohort of students is taken from every single Muslim country, whether it be Pakistan, whether it will be Bangladesh, whether it will be Somalia, whether it will be Egypt, whether even Britain, any place where you find Muslims, they will take a cohort of students every year to their universities like Medina University, and they will train them, they will give them everything free of charge. Free plane tickets, free accommodation, free tuition fees, free food. I remember back in the 90s, I was actually invited to go and study in Medina myself. So there was local brothers where I was, and they had gone to Medina University. And they were saying, you should come, it's amazing, everything's free, you get flights twice a year, you get flights home. But the best thing is, every Friday you get a full roasted lamb to eat. So that was the highlight of those. So they were enjoying themselves, yeah? Now, over 10, 20, 30 years, this started having a massive effect. Because these students are now graduating. You know, every year there's graduates coming out. Where are they going? They're going back to their homelands, their home countries. And all of them are then spreading that teaching. They're becoming teachers, Islamic studies teachers. Some may become imams. Some of them may set up their own institutions or masjids. So this has a massive, massive effect. Until today, when in every Muslim country now you have the Salafi teaching has spread everywhere. Yeah? Dramatically. Now moving on to the Westernized secularists. These were the people who start imitating the West. Can anyone think of any examples of? Give me an example of a Westernized secularist. Aga Khan? Probably. He's more of a different teaching though, isn't he? Ataturk is a classic good example, yeah? Anyone else? Quilliam Foundation, yes? I would agree with that. That's a good current contemporary one. Any others famous leaders of Muslim countries you can think of? I mean, there's loads, I'm sure you can think of quite a few. Now, these people arose as a direct result of colonization. So, you had British in India for 200 years. They were setting up British schools, everything, you know, they were educating people in their British system. So, you started having this, what was the elite group amongst the population. In Algeria, the French were doing the same thing. In all the Muslim countries where the Europeans were, they were creating this elite tier. Really, they were creating them because they wanted them to actually run the empire for them. Because they didn't have enough indigenous people, you know. It's amazing how Britain, tiny island, was controlling over 1/4 of the world's land surface area. They said in India they only had 9,000 white British people controlling a population of millions. So they needed to train up the local people, yeah, to run the empire for them, to run the administration. They would never get to the top levels like the white British, of course, but there were a certain political tier that they were creating, sort of an administrative tier. Now these people, you know, were so British and so French that you could hear this sort of phrase, you know, more British than the British. Yeah. If you come across some Pakistan, and this is obviously carries on till today, you know, you'll find in every Muslim country there'll be certain people that will be more European than Europeans. So I've seen Pakistani people who will tell you about the Magna Carta, you know, about the English Civil War, Revolution. Even the British people don't know about these things, you know. Ask the average white guy, they haven't got a clue. So these people are really sort of, you know, really in that culture, the Western culture. Now, in the same way that the Western political ideologies go between right and left, these people also will either be liberals or they'll be Marxists or they may be, you know, on the right wing as well. But that's more rare, obviously. Until today, these people remain the sort of ruling classes in many Muslim countries. So, for example, in Pakistan, if you look at the news channels, you know, very Westernized dress, very Westernized language, very secular language, yeah. So, after, you know, the various different countries, they break away from colonial rule. I'm just thinking of a way to speed this up now. You get these various sort of Marxist and left-wing socialist movements in the Muslim world, which were very, very popular actually. So we can't just say it was a, you know, a fringe group amongst the Muslims or anything. This was the Muslim masses were supporting these leaders, you know, and we can't really deny that. So, in a way, this had permeated amongst the Muslim masses as well, you know, this belief in, say, Marxism or socialism. But often it was sold to the masses as an Islamic Marxism or an Islamic socialism, you know.
But also, brother, maybe the vast masses looked at it as a way of defeating the colonialists So they would represent themselves as saying, look, we're one of you.
Yeah, definitely.
You
yeah,
know,
yeah.
you've got these colonials here. We're going to stand up to them, and we're going to rule. So you rather have somebody from your own land ruling you as opposed to somebody from an outside land. So
Definitely,
I think these they use that.
They definitely use that, they would do it under the banner of Islam or pan-Islamism or pan-Arabism, etc. So these type of characters like Jamal Abdel Nasser, Saddam Hussein, Hafiz Assad, Zulfikar Bhutto, Gaddafi, all socialists, all, came in popular sort of revolutions that took power in those countries. I don't think we can really deny the popular backing that they had at the time when they came into power initially. But the leaders of these movements were very secular. They didn't really believe in Islam as a living tradition, as they didn't believe in the Sharia. They believed that the Sharia is a backward thing, and it needs complete reform in a sense of getting rid of many of the core beliefs. So they believed in things like communism, socialism, liberal democracy, and so on. Yeah? So there's a classic example of one. For example, Benazir Bhutto said that Sharia had punishments are barbaric. A clear statement of, dismissing of the Sharia. That was the really type of people they were. I sadly have to say, barely I can count them as Muslims. And some of them were probably Muslim. Allah knows best. Some of them were outside the pale of Islam. People like Ataturk. You can't really even say he's a Muslim. Allah knows best. I know some of my own teachers have really said in the worst possible terms he was the worst, not even Muslim at all.
She was a Shia, wasn't she?
Benazir Bhutto? I have no idea. Let's not go into that now, because there's many Pakistanis here, and this could get quite heated debate, so let's skip that one. These people generally tend to view Islam and, mullahs as they call them, as very backward, living in the Middle Ages. They don't know what's going on. We're the sort of rational, progressive, modern people. They not only hold Western ideologies, but they actually have a Western world view. And this is where I would have to put the question, which ummah do they belong to? Because how do you define an ummah? An ummah, a civilization, is people who share a common set of cultural values and beliefs. Now, if all of your values and beliefs are the same as the West, then you're a Westerner. So like these Quilliam guys now, they've gone to the point where everything, there's no Islam left. Homosexuality, whatever, one witness, women witnesses, there should be only one, blah, blah, blah. So all of their values and beliefs have become the same as the Westerner. How are they Muslim anymore? Just because they say they're Muslim, how does that make them Muslim? So there has to be a point where we have to actually say which ummah do they belong to. Because an ummah is a civilization, it's a collective cultural grouping that share common attitudes, beliefs, values, and so on. And then you have the Rationalist Modernists. Now these are a different group. These were people who were quite, they believed in rationalism and science, but at the same time they did have a strong belief in the validity of the Sharia. And they believe that the Quran is valid for all times and places. Some of them may say, okay, we have to discard many of the hadith, for example. That was their way of but generally speaking, they believed in the Sharia, but they went to a slight extreme in the fact of being very ultra-rationalist. So for example, there's people like Muhammad Haykal, one of these type of people who wrote a biography of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and said that the Prophet ﷺ did not perform any miracles. Apart from bringing the Quran, he didn't perform any miracles. This is clearly against the established Sahih Hadith, Mutawatir Hadith even, that the Prophet ﷺ created many miracles. But you see that sort of scientific thinking was dominating these type of people. So once again, they put reason above revelation, which was a feature of the Mu'tazilites. So these are the main figures that sort of spearhead the movement. Jamaluddin Afghani, Muhammad Abdul Rashid Rida, they are all grand sheikhs of Al-Azhar. So this movement is originating in Egypt and Al-Azhar, and it's at the beginning of the 20th century. It's suspected of close links to Islam. Once again, the thing they had common with the Salafi Wahhabis, they had one thing in common, which both groups rejected the following of the four schools of law. So, and these were actually called Salafis, confusingly as well. This group, Rashid Rida's group, were actually called Salafis at some stage in the history as well. So generally, these modern, so the Mu'tazilites and the Khawarij, you could say what they had in common here is they both rejected the following of the four madhabs and sort of that Orthodox Sunni paradigm that we talked about. So this was Muhammad Abdu, one of the pioneers of this type of teaching. I will just skip, I'll finish in about 5 minutes inshallah, I won't keep it too long. Won't go into detail. Now he issued a ruling that interest loans are permissible. So you can see this sort of modernist trend that they wanted to have a new ijtihad. All four schools had agreed that usury is one of the greatest sins. But because now he's abandoned the four schools, he's able to do a new ijtihad and say that, in modern times with European trade and power and all this, we have to get up to date, we have to allow these type of loans to take place. So not surprisingly, the British were quite happy with him. And in fact, when he gave that fatwa, they were the first Azhari Sheikh to allow riba on certain types of loans. Immediately the British government gave a massive loan to Egypt. And so they got him into that debt cycle. There's some reports that he was a Freemason. There are references for that if people want to look it up. But Rashid Rida was definitely a Freemason. He was in the Freemason Lodge. This was his good friend Lord Cromer, the British guy. Once again, these are some of the things that he was talking about. For example, he said, that microorganisms could be jinn, like bacteria and things. So that type of thing, trying to get European science, but trying to make Islam compatible with it, but just going a bit too silly and a bit too far. That microbes may possibly be a species of jinn. You can see the way he's dressed as well, becoming very Westernized now and all of that stuff, sorry, let's go back to that. Now, from there we're coming to the 1900s, so the Ottoman Khilafah comes to an end. So these political movements arise that are calling for the Khilafah to come back. The main figures of these movements are people like Maududi in India, Sayyid Qutb, and I haven't mentioned Hassan al-Banna. Obviously Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, and Sayyid Qutb was further down the line, one of the main leaders of the Ikhwan. So in the Arab countries, in Egypt, which is one of the most populous Arab countries, you had the Ikhwan al-Muslimin come about, and in India you had the Jamaat-e-Islami type of movements led by Maududi. All of these movements had in common, they were calling back for Sharia. They believed in the Sharia, they wanted the Khilafah to be re-established. And as I said, any of the above could be part of those movements. Yeah? So amongst the Ikhwan al-Muslimin you would find modernist, rationalists, you would find traditionalists, Sufis, and all sorts of different people. Yeah? It wasn't limited to one of those groups. And then finally we can talk about the Traditionalist Revival, which is those people who said, no, we stick to the four schools of law, we stick to the Ash'ari Maturidi theology, and we stick to Tasawwuf and the way of the Sufis, even though we accept that there may be excesses that need to be kept within the Sharia, but we don't abandon that core traditional teaching that was with us for 1,000 years. Shah Waliullah is one of the main people who revived this in India. So all of the Dar al-Ulooms now, whether they're Brelvi or Deobandi or from Nadwa, all of them trace back to Shah Waliullah, who came about at the same time as Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. So his revival was, however, more of a traditionalist revival, in that he stuck to the madhabs, even though he did criticize those who are very fanatically following one madhab. And he also criticized the Sufis that were going to excesses in different things, but he himself was a Sufi as well. So his revivalist movement had a massive impact in the Indo-Pak subcontinent. This is actually the largest Muslim group in the world. I should have asked you if you know, it would have been a good guessing game. It's actually the Tablighi Jamaat. Right? They are, by most people, estimate the largest Islamic group in the Muslim world. They hold ijtima of millions, right? In places like India and so on. This is their gathering in Malaysia, their sort of international gathering, you see, you know. So this is what you could class under the sort of traditionalist revival movements. They avoid the use of digital media. As you notice, they don't have websites or things. Do they? Maybe they do now.
If they're the largest group,
Yeah.
then aren't they the Ahlus-Sunnah wal Jama'ah?
I agree, they are part of Ahl-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, yes. So traditional Islam, they're one group within that. So the Ahl-Sunnah wal Jama'ah is bigger than just the Tablighi Jamaat, but yes, they are, you know, because they follow the four schools of law, the Aqidah schools and so on. And they accept Sufism as well. So despite what the Deobandis and Barelvis may tell you about each other, ignore all of that. Both groups are fully within the Ahl-Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Both groups accept the four schools of law. Both groups accept Ash'ari Maturidi Aqidah, and both groups accept Tasawwuf and the Sufi teachings. There is such a bitter fighting between them though. Yeah.
The Tablighis, are they Deobandis?
Yeah, they're from the Deobandi side, yeah. The fighting between them becomes so bitter that they accuse each other of such things that aren't really, the case. This is the 6 principles of the Tablighi Jamaat. We don't have time to go into them today. So as I mentioned, the Indian, the madrasas, and many madrasas in other traditional, like Mahad al-Fath in Syria, causing this traditional type of revival. And then finally we had then this revival of traditional Islam in the West, interestingly, which took place in European countries, led by certain people, European converts, often influenced by Sufis. So Friedrich Schwann, he's sort of people influenced by him directly or indirectly, or some of them are his direct disciples, are people like Titus Burkhardt, Martin Link, Sayyid Nasser. Then you had Abdul Qadir, a Sufi, and used to be known as Murabit. When he was not Muslim, his name was Ian Dallas, he was actually an actor. He had a massive impact, not very well known person, but if you look at the people that have studied with him, like Hamza Yusuf, Dr. Umar Abdullah, these are all people that have studied with him for many years. You see the sort of impact he has had, He's still alive, he's, I believe now in South Africa, and has a small jama'ah there. These people were actually causing a traditionalist revival in the West. They were having a major critique of modernity and the West in general from a traditional Islamic point of view. So from the point of view of the madhabs, the Ash'ari Maturidi theology and the Sufism. So this is really revolutionary. And I think the effects of this teaching has now actually gone back to impact the Muslim world, the traditional Muslim world as well. Aisha Bewley is another prolific student of Abdul Qadir Sufi.
Is he the same Sheikh who's part of the Norwich crowd?
That's right, yeah.
He's the one,
The same people here from the Norwich crowd.
Grenada.
Norwich.
Yeah.
He lived in the Highlands for a while in a castle. And was based there as well.
Interesting.
Yeah, but now they're in South Africa, is the latest I heard. And then of course we had our, my own teacher, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, who, I would say obviously history will tell, but I think history will say that he was one of the major figures of revival for traditional Islam in the West, but then impacting on the East. I've seen my own self, his massive impact he's now had on the East as well. There we go. Any questions or comments? Please feel free. if the hunger hasn't overwhelmed you or anything. Yes, sir.
If the Tablighis are the largest part of the people who call themselves the Ahl Sunnah wal Jamaat, doesn't that defeat the purpose of the Ahl Sunnah wal Jamaat? Because since the Tablighis are the largest group, doesn't the title of Ahl Sunnah wal Jamaat just pass on to them?
Yeah, the thing with Tablighi Jamaat, they're not, they are a Jamaat, right? They're a movement, they're a group with a specific aim. So they're not a group in the sense of a sect.
Right.
So within the Sunni world, let's say, the Sunni world is defined by those who follow the four schools of law and the associated theological schools. Yeah? And generally accept Sufism as well. If we define the Sunni world as that, the Tablighi Jamaat are a group who do dawah. You know, they go out, they invite other people to Islam. That's their function. They're not a sect or a different teaching, if you see what I mean.
So they're still calling themselves part of the Ahl Sunnah wal
Oh,
Jamaat,
yes,
and
yes.
they're all-
So I think you have to look at it the other way around in terms of, you have to look at the definition of Ahl Sunnah wal Jamaat. So we aren't Tablighi, well, I personally I'm not a Tablighi, but I am part of Ahl Sunnah wal Jamaat. Just because I'm not a Tablighi doesn't mean I'm not part of the Ahl Sunnah wal Jamaat. You just what I mean?
Yeah.
So you look at it holistically.
So, you know, for example, we're part of, say, like Meem Foundation. That's pretty much similar thing. We're an organization with specific aims to teach people. Tablighi Jamaat is an organization with the aim of spreading Islam. They've just become huge, you know. Inshallah, we'll get to that size. Yes.
Just ask a short question. What's the difference between the Ahl Hadith, which is named in Pakistan, and the Salafis?
Very good question. With the Ahl Hadith, within Sunni Islam, there have always been a Hadith movement, historically, always. And the followers of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, one of the first Imams, they were associated with that Hadith type of movement. And they were actually called Ahlul Hadith. So Ahlul Hadith in itself is not away from Sunni Islam. The complication becomes that, for example, the Salafi Wahhabi sect, it's a spectrum. It's not just one group. You know, there's a whole spectrum of opinion. Some of them are closer to Sunni Islam. Some of them are further away from Sunni Islam. So some of the people who call themselves Ahlul Hadith may have become quite influenced by the Salafi Wahhabi teachings as well. So there may be a grey area, you know, and that's the nature of different types of sects and movements. You can't always clearly define who's a Sunni and who are, say, Salafis, for example. So I think if we keep that criterion in mind, if the Ahlul Hadith, they say they follow the Hanbali madhab, which is a Hadith madhab. The Hanbali madhab is that we follow Hadith, you know. If they generally fall within the Hanbali madhab, then they fall within Sunni Muslims, you know. However, what I would say is a clear demarcation is where people start making takfir of Muslims, other Muslims, when they start saying other Muslims are disbelievers and making their blood halal, that is where you have a clear line where they've now gone into Wahhabism or Kharijism. So just by default, I wouldn't say someone who's Ahlul Hadith is outside of Sunni Islam. It depends. Another main thing, like Shaykh Dr Uthmani also talked about this. He said if the people that call themselves Ahlul Hadith, if at the same time they respect the opinion of the four schools, so they respect differences of opinion, then that means they're within our fold of Sunni Islam. Because one of the main features of Sunni Islam is we respect difference of opinion. But if they don't, if they say our opinion is right and everything else is wrong, then that takes them outside of Sunni Islam.
There are some people of madhab that go to that extreme as well.
So say only our madhab is correct. Yeah.
Then they.
No, they're Sunni by default because they're following one of the four schools. And that's also been a feature historically. You know, so there have often been ulama that have come about saying, you know, we shouldn't be so fanatic to our madhab. Even Imam Ghazali is one of them. Who said, you know, there's four schools, we need to respect each other's opinions. So generally, it developed that people did start respecting difference of opinion. but you still find sometimes a bit of fanaticism, you know. Yes.
Is it authentic Hanbalism in this day and age? Because I've heard a lot of that the people who defend the Saudis say
Yeah.
that the shuyukh there follow the Hanbali madhab. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. Like I said, there are grey areas in this issue. What I would say is, like I said, the crux, the clear line, defining line should be, do they tolerate difference of opinion? If they claim to be Hanbali, but they accept that the Hanafi madhab is a valid madhab, that Malikism was valid, Shafiism is valid, and they don't make takfir of other Muslims and fight them, then we can accept them as Hanbalis, you know. But if they don't accept, and they do especially make takfir of Muslims, then we say they're Salafis.
There's a book which I've read. It's called Confession of a British Spy.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that book.
Yeah, and that actually traces how Hamford trapped Abdul Wahab. I mean, it gives the whole history.
Oh, Muhammad ibn Wahab himself.
Yeah, Confessions of a British
Yeah,
Spy.
I heard about it. Yeah. I never checked out how authentic it is or anything like that. So.
Sheikh, are there any large traditional Islamic movements outside of the Tablighi Jamaat in, for example, North Africa or the rest of the Muslim world?
Well, you know, I think the largest movements are the Sufi tariqas until today. You know, inshallah we didn't have time today, but when I do the history course, I'm going to look at that in a lot more detail. You know, the role of the Sufi tariqas historically. For 500 years, you know, they were actually the main glue that were joining the Muslims around the world. You know, the Sufi tariqas, they were people who followed the madhabs. They had the theology of Ash'ari Maturidi, but then they had the tasawwuf and the spiritual dimension as well. And this became by far the most popular movements around the Muslim world. And until today, I think that's the case. If you look at, you know, vast majority of, for example, Indo-Pak, you know, they're often linked up to tariqas or Sufi sheikhs. In the Arab world, it has deteriorated a lot, diminished a lot.
Yeah.
Because Salafism has become so big in the Arab world specifically. But in the rest of the Muslim world, I'd still say Sufi tariqas are the biggest. I don't know, but it seems to me they're still the biggest movement.
Are they generally quite low key though? Because
It varies really.
Really.
Why would you say they're low key?
For example, in terms of talking about the Tablighi Jamaat, how well known and aware people are about them all around the world and how big they are. The other traditional groupings aren't as well known or large. Maybe from like a well-known point of view.
I think so. Like, who hasn't heard of Sheikh Nazim, for example? Who hasn't heard of some of these big Sufi sheikhs nowadays? They've got thousands of followers, maybe millions sometimes.
Yeah, no, but they're movements.
Yeah.
No.
You mean they're not very active?
Yeah, you hear about the names,
Yeah.
but you don't hear as much about their movements. Maybe because we are
I think
within the subcontinent, amongst the Pakistani community, we hear more about the Tablighi Jamaat, whereas maybe outside.
I mean, like, for example, the Habaib from Yemen, they're very active. You know, they are very active in Dawah. You know, they're expanding their circles all the time, getting more and more people in. So, I think in a way you're possibly right in that their method of revival is to keep. They're not necessarily to make a big hoo-ha about things. You know, like for example, Sheikh Hamza, his main thing has been focusing on teaching and learning. You know, reviving the religious sciences. Engaging in the intellectual jihad, which is the jihad of the day, and so on. So
they're saying in Saudi that there are many halaqahs of people who do follow madhabs, who have actually rejected the mainstream Wahhabi thought, and they do even things like dhikr, they get together.
there are,
and it's a lot bigger than we would assume.
There are. I mean, I know personally the Hanafi. There are whole towns with Hanafi shuyukh, Shafi'is like the Habaib. You know, they're Shafi'is.
In Saudi Arabia.
So my friend went to Umrah 2 months ago, and they had a Mawlid in Saudi Arabia.
Wow.
Yeah,
So,
many
yeah.
Mawlid, many
And it
Mawlid.
was well,
Rooftop
well
Mawlid.
attended, and it wasn't like people hiding and doing it. Well attended, and people who were sponsoring it were well funded. They basically had taxis carrying people. So obviously they couldn't do it in the big city, in the suburbs.
Yeah.
You know, the Saudi family is propped up by Americans, you know. That place is rife to be, revolution in that place. Obviously the Salafi teaching must be widespread because of all these decades of, that preaching and hearing it in the mimbars all the time. But there is still a lot of traditional Islam, still there. Yeah. So yeah, come on, you were trying to say something.
No, I was just saying there were the dhikrs, yeah. Rooftop dhikrs are quite sort of
Really?
popular, yeah, in these hotels now.
So you don't get the local police saying, oh, stop that, do that.
You were saying about the deen Jamaats being the biggest group.
Don't do it here.
There's a lot of Tablighi Jamaatis in Pakistan who are Ahl Hadith, and they don't do Mawlids. And I've heard that the original books that were written by the sheikhs of that Jamaat, they were all pro madhabs, but now things have changed. Like even the books have been changed because my father-in-law's got old copies and he's got new copies and new copies. Those things have vanished from there.
Well, to be honest, the whole Deobandi Barelvi issue, I'm unapologetically going to say we need to move on beyond that. Mawlid, some people may not agree with Mawlid, they're still Sunni. Agreeing with Mawlid doesn't make you a Sunni or not Sunni. Obviously I agree with Mawlid, I don't see anything wrong with that, but and all this thing about certain books that were written and there were certain insults to the Prophet ﷺ in certain books, and people have got copies of those books and they can show you quotes from those books. All of that is all well and good, but I think, we need to move on from that, As a generality, amongst the Deobandis, they are Sunni. There may well be some that are more influenced by Salafi teachings, and I think in Nadwatul Ulama there are definitely some that are quite Salafi orientated. So once again we look back at those definitions that we have, but most Deobandi people that I've met, shuyukh, students, they very much follow Hanafi school of law. They very much follow the Aqidah of Ash'ari Maturidi Aqidah, although they tend not to study it that much nowadays. They definitely have a tariqah, they definitely follow tasawwuf, although they tend to keep it low key. Even like Shaykh Akram Nadwi, who's one of my teachers from Nadwatul Ulama, who are no doubt, they read the books of Ibn Taymiyyah and all of that stuff. So they're quite sort of al-Hadith type orientated. But at the end of the day, he's teaching Hanafi school of law. He himself has bay'ah with the Sufi Sheikh. So he has Naqshbandi tariqah. And they have so they have all of that. So I think particularly as Muslims in this country, we need to leave the Deobandi Barelvi dispute behind us. It's irrelevant to us, to be honest. We don't, the points that they argue about, we don't need to argue about them. We don't really need to talk about them,
What about places like Qatar? Not Qatar, Kuwait. What is the makeup there? Would you classify them as the Najdi type as well? Or how far does that...
Before we go to that, sister, is that okay? Or, so, like I said, amongst the Deobandis, there are some that are probably closer to Salafism. There's no doubt about that. There are some. But the majority, I would say, are not, really. And they have high degree of respect for the Prophet ﷺ, love for the Prophet ﷺ. No doubt about that. I'm sorry, brother, I don't know much about Kuwait, to be honest. The internal politics. The Khalijis, generally Arab world is very, very dominated by Salafi movements now, all Arab countries. But I don't know the ins and outs of Kuwait.